Welcome to Marking the End Times. I'm Mark Hitchcock, and my wife Cheryl and I just returned with about 80 people from a 2-week trip to Greece. And we saw a lot of the great sites of the second and third missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. Places like Thessaloniki and Philippi and Athens and Corinth, and even the great city of Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey. We had a great time on this trip, and I want to share a message with you that I brought on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, where the Apostle John was banished when he received the revelation, all that he received and wrote down in the book of Revelation. And you'll see in just a moment, but the setting for this video is a small theater just outside what's called the cave or the grotto of the Apocalypse. This is the traditional site where John received the visions of the book of Revelation. And in the background, as I'm giving this message, you're going to see the beautiful little port of Scala. It's the main port there on the island of Patmos. I hope you enjoy this message. God bless you. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. The book of Revelation is called the Revelation of Jesus Christ. I think I gave this illustration in church not long ago, but it fits very fitting here. When the Turks overran Greece, they came into a lot of the churches and plastered over, a lot of the pictures of Christ and the various things inside the churches. And several centuries later, when the Greeks were able to take control of those churches again, they came in and took that plaster off. And it's been pointed out, that Jesus Christ, who had been hidden for centuries, was unveiled. And people could see him again for the first time in centuries. And really, that's what you have in the book of Revelation. Jesus has been hidden from this world now for centuries, but one of these days he's going to be unveiled again. That's what Revelation means. The revelation is the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ, when he's going to be unveiled to this world. And just a little bit of background to add to what the guides said to us. If you have your copy of Revelation, you can open it up. But it says in chapter 1, verse 4, after the beginning of the book, where John's told he's going to see things, and he's supposed to write down what he sees. So this book is a book of visions, and he's writing down these things he sees. But it says John to the 7 churches in Asia. We believe, again, like they said, this is the Apostle John, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee, the disciple that Jesus loved. And he writes to these 7 churches, one of which we went to today, to Ephesus, to that location. You have these 6 others that are mentioned as well. And when he goes on down in verse 8, and he sees he has a vision, the beginning of the resurrected radiant Christ. It was pointed out, he hears a voice behind him like the sound of many waters. He turns around, sees the radiant resurrected Christ, falls down at his feet like a dead man. Now think about, this is the disciple Jesus loved. The one at the Last Supper is leaning on Jesus' breast, and here he is 60 years later, and he falls down dead at Jesus' feet. But I love verse 8. Jesus says, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the first and last letter of the Greek alphabet. He's the beginning, he's the end, he's everything in between. And he says, I'm the one who was, who is, and who is to come, the Almighty. Now that's my favorite word in the book of Revelation, that word Almighty. And it's used of God the Father. I believe in Jesus as well. But it's a word pantokrator. And the word pantos means everything or all. And krator or kratein can have the idea of to have in your hand or to hold. And so literally the word pantokrator means someone that has everything in their hands or has their hands on everything. You remember the little song, he's got the whole world in his hands. But that's really what pantokrator means. Jesus has his hands on everything. And that's one of the greatest things in life, just to know as we look at our world around us, how crazy it is, that Jesus is the pantokrator. He has his hands literally on everything that's happening. He says in verse 9, I, John, your brother. Now, he doesn't ever call himself an apostle, so a lot of people think this wasn't John the apostle. But again, he'd been there with these people in these churches for 3 decades, and he's not having to call himself an apostle. He's one they know well. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus. So there's persecution, kind of intermittent persecution going on in these 7 churches where he's ministering. He says, I was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Now, a lot of you probably heard sermons over the years where John is banished out here to Patmos from Ephesus out here to this island, and that this island was like Alcatraz. I mean, I heard that when I was a little kid growing up, and that really makes an impact on you. It's this penal colony. It's this, this prison island, and John gets banished out here. He's 90 years old, but that's not what Patmos was like. Patmos, up where the monastery is, there was a temple of Artemis there. Down by Scala, by the port, there may have been a temple to Apollo. At one point in time, there was a hippodrome or a horse racing track here on the island of Patmos. There was all kinds of things going on, a large administrative center, a village that was here where John, according to Prochorus, led people to Christ and baptized them. So this wasn't some penal colony. And there's also a legend that John, when he was 90 years of age, was sent here and had to work in the mines. Well, there's no evidence there's any mines on this island. There's nothing to mine. So John was simply banished here by Domitian to get him away from his influence there in those churches. Domitian used banishment often. Nero killed people. John Paul and Peter were killed, but Domitian banished. One thing I'll just mention, they mentioned earlier about the date of when John was banished in 95 AD. That's really an important issue to me because I wrote my dissertation at Dallas Seminary on defending the Domitian date of the book of Revelation. It's that he wrote it in 95 AD. I'll just mention why I did that. There's a whole view called preterism, and they see most of the book of Revelation, if not all of it, being fulfilled around 70 AD. So obviously if it's a prophecy and it's fulfilled in 70 AD, it had to be written before that. So they dated around 65 AD during the time of Nero. So I wrote my dissertation kind of to disprove preterism, because that's one of their big points they make that was written earlier to defend the 95 date of the book. And so if you ever really have bad insomnia and you need something to do, you can read that and it'll really help. But what's interesting, I was here right after 1995, I think in 97 or so, and they had just had the 1900th anniversary of John receiving the vision there of the apocalypse. So it's interesting, here on the island, I actually asked one of the priests up there in the monastery if he'd ever heard of the book of Revelation being written in 65 AD. And he started laughing about that. He'd never even heard of it before, which again doesn't prove it's not true, but it was an interesting point that, on this island, which is the place where the events took place, it's always this date of 95 in the time of Domitian. But John says in verse 10, I was in the Spirit. We talked about that earlier. He got moved into a trance-like state. But he says, on the Lord's day. And again, then he hears this voice behind him of the radiant, resurrected Christ. Now, if that's the place down there in that cave, and there's a lot of tradition that it is. Remember how they said that extra piece had been added on? So that, where it was all open. And that's the side of the cave that looks back towards the mainland where we came from, where Ephesus is. And you can see that on a clear day. I don't know, nowadays there may be more smog or whatever, but you can see the coastline there on a clear day. And so some have believed that John may have gone to that cave always on Sundays on the Lord's Day, because he would look back and think about the churches back there and pray for these believers who were there and his concern for them. And if that's true, to me that's just a beautiful picture of a pastor, a shepherd who loved those people and found a place to be by himself and to look back to the mainland. And I'm sure he prayed for all those churches and the various things that were happening there. But he's in this trance-like state. And again, I won't go on to talk about the whole book, but chapter 1, verse 19 is kind of the outline of the book of Revelation. John's told there, write down what you've seen, write down the things which are, and write the things that will be after these things. And so chapter 1 is what John has just seen. This radiant, resurrected Christ, this vision. Chapters 2 and 3 are the things that are. Those are the 7 churches. And then in chapter 4, verse 1, it begins with the word, after these things. Actually ends with that as well. So that's when I think in chapter 4 that John, I like to put it like this, he was like put in a spiritual time machine and taken to the future. And he's shown all these visions of what's going to happen. So chapter 1, I like to call the Christ. Chapters 2 and 3, the churches, and then chapters 4 to the end, the consummation. And in chapter 4 and 5, John's caught up to heaven. And then when you go through the book of Revelation, what you'll find is, once you get the chapters 2 and 3 on, it ping-pongs back and forth from heaven to earth. So in chapters 2 and 3, it's on earth. Then in chapters 4 and 5, it goes up to heaven. Chapters 6 and 7, you come back to earth. Beginning of chapter 8, it's back to heaven. And it goes that way throughout the whole book. And what it's doing by using that technique, I think, is showing that everything that's happening here on earth is being controlled by God in heaven.